we'll get to it in a minute, but McGowan released a lecture on Death Drive you can listen to here on YouTube, and it's absolutely fantastic. And we're gonna kind of follow in his footsteps here as we discuss it, because I was preparing to do. Cleve and I have been discussing the idea of doing a Death Drive stream for a long time, and I've been putting together notes piece by piece for a while now. But about a month ago, McGowan up and released a lecture on Death Drive, and it's just amazing. So we're going to base what we're doing here off of what he did, because it would be impossible, I think, for me to have a better structure to a Death Drive lecture than the structure of his. So we'll come back to that. As far as what somebody should do, I'm going to still try to approach this almost as a standalone lecture. In some ways, I don't think we're going to need as many of the concepts we used in the first two lectures here. This is really just an introduction to Death Drive, and maybe down the road we'll come back, because we could do a couple more lectures on Death Drive. Like, this is just an introductory one. For example, LACAN, we'll see as we move into here, but there's 4 primary drives that LACAN talks about: oral drive, anal drive, scopic drive. And so there's 4 altogether. And he says that every drive is a death drive. So death drive is something at work in the 4 primary drives. But because we're just doing an introduction to Death Drive, we're not going to go into each specific drive. That's a lecture on its own, and that would be too complicated and too much right now to get into. And so we're just going to focus on Death Drive. And so I honestly don't think the work we did in the first 2 lectures is required here, because as we saw in the first 2, right, once you get into these Lacanian concepts, they all kind of tie together. But for whatever reason, I think we can kind of do this in a way that's isolatable. And yet, if you do listen to this one first and you go back, you'll start to be able to plug it in to what we already did. So I think this one actually just happens to serve as a standalone. If you want standalone.
So Anarchist Tech Support's asking, why not just use Thanatos then? All those 4 names condensed into one topic. I've seen that old Greek name used to describe the Death Drive so many times, and usually paired with Euros.
Yeah, and we're definitely gonna touch on that. I guess because what we were going for isn't, I mean, Thanatos is synonymous with Death Drive, but we wanted to list the main thinkers we were going to be discussing. Death Drive is such a huge concept and has had so much impact on psychoanalysis in general that you could do a whole series of lectures on what other psychoanalysts have done with it. But of course, because I operate in this Freudian, Lacanian, Zizek'ian context, and Todd McGowan is very much a kind of Zizek'ian, Lacanian, Hegelian. He's very much, his framework is very similar to Zizek's. And so McGowan's in this same tradition or this same context. And so that's why we wanted to list those names, is because you have this chain of thinkers that have developed this concept in their own unique ways, and yet they're all kind of developing it together in a sense.
Well, and we'll get more into how it breaks down into those 4 different names as well. But I think that Death Drive, if you say, though Death Drive might be synonymous with Thanatos, you don't, it doesn't necessarily, if you say Thanatos, insinuate that 4-fold division, right? Like, because that's kind of that's a Freudian like way of dissecting this. And then obviously we're more interested in the way that LACAN brings it into his work. So,
and if I remember correctly, Freud never even used Thanatos to refer to Death Drive. One of his followers ended up calling it that, I believe. And maybe LACAN uses Thanatos, but I mean, Zizek does. I've got a quote we're going to talk about where he uses it, but yeah, if I remember correctly, Freud didn't ever even use that term. I mean, he used eros all the time, but I think thanatos is a good word for it. I like it. So
yeah, no, totally. So I've got a couple of. Well, it also makes me think of Thanos, which is kind of.
I know, and that's the whole thing. Is like Thanos is very much Death Drive. Okay. Yeah. It's it's fitting in that regard.
Cool. But while I'm getting set up, you wanna set the basis here for where have we been? Where are we going? What's going on here?
Okay, so we have been doing a series of lectures on Jacques Lacan, and in the first lecture we talked about his three registers: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And I always preface it by saying, for lack of a better term, those are the three key areas, domains, orders that make up the human psyche or the human condition. Those aren't the best words, because when you say psyche, you tend to think of some sort of like enclosed space, and that's far from what he's doing. But we could say that those are the three main dimensions or aspects, areas of human reality, of human ontology. Again, he would even probably have problems with that. But simply put, they're the three main aspects of what it is to be human. So we talked about the three registers or the three orders in the first lecture, and then in the second one we moved into fantasy. And here we're going to do Death Drive. And so with each one of these, we've just been discussing some new aspect of Lacanian theory. And so I wanted to talk about this one because I think it's really important. I think when you get a good understanding of Death Drive, it forever changes how you view yourself, how you view others, how you view society. And I think it's a crucial concept in understanding what happens in politics. This is why Zizek uses it time and time again. I was telling Plebe earlier that I haven't read all of Zizek's books yet, but I'm willing to bet that in all 50 of them, I think he's up to 50 books now, he does something with Death Drive. He's always going back to Death Drive to analyze what it is to be human, or how politics works, or how ideology works. And so Death Drive's of fundamental importance. So it's often misunderstood, and it has a whole array of interpretations. And so what we're going to do here is, based on Todd McGowan's fantastic lecture, and based on his lecture, we're going to move through the key thinkers who have used this concept. So here's one of the most important things that needs to just be stated up front. Whenever you go read Freud, there is a fundamental problem in the translation. The official translation was translated by James Strachey, and I think the most famous mistake he makes in his translations of Freud is that he translates the word Trieb, which is Freud's word for drive. He translates Trieb as instinct, but the problem is, in German, there's a word for instinct. It's instinct, just spelled with a K instead of a C. And so Freud made this absolutely crucial, fundamental distinction between instincts, which are like animal instincts, or just basic biological needs, right? You have an instinct to have a certain amount of food each day, right? So all of that kind of stuff. And Freud was saying there's this other kind of impulse inside of us that is not reducible to biological instincts, and he calls this drive. And again, his term for it was Trieb. But in the English translations, both instinct and drive, the German, instinct and Trieb, get translated with the same word, instinct.
Disaster.
It's completely confusing.
Yeah. Lacan picks up on this because we've been reading Seminar 11 together, right? So
yeah,
he talks about it in there. Yeah.
Here, I wonder if I just right off can find that quote, because
because I think Americans are just generally pretty aware of the idea of instinct, and there's like, there's nature versus nurture. Some stuff seems like it's probably somewhat instinctual, but there's that general idea that humans have to learn, whereas creatures who don't have big frontal cortexes, they just inherit instincts, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, okay, I found it. It's on page 49 of LACAN Seminar 11. And he says, those who do not know German should read it in the English translation. You will find this translation, I say this in passing, quite entertaining. You will see, for example, that the translation of instinct for Trieb and instinctual for Triebhat has so many drawbacks for the translator that although it is maintained throughout quite uniformly, thus basing the whole edition on a complete misunderstanding, since Trieb and instinct have nothing in common, the discord becomes so impossible at one point that the implications of a sentence cannot be carried through by translating Triebhat as instinctual. And so a footnote becomes necessary. At the beginning of the next paragraph, the word Trieb is much more revealing of urgency than the word instinctual. Trieb gives you a kick in the arse, my friends, quite different from so-called instinct. That's how psychoanalytic teaching is passed on. And so he's saying so many people have made a fundamental mistake in understanding death drive throughout the psychoanalytic tradition in the English-speaking world because of this terrible translation and the blurring of the line between this distinction Freud makes between drive and instinct. And so that's, if you go try to read Freud, you'll often be surprised. Like, I don't see the word drive, and it's there in the German, it's just not translated. And so that's a problem, super huge problem in trying to understand Freud accurately. So, and Lacan right there at the end, he's saying like so much bullshit in the English-speaking world concerning psychoanalysis comes from this misunderstanding, this mistranslation of drive and instinct. So
yeah,
that's just super important to say up front.
Yeah, the Freud taught in high school or colleges in the United States is not the Freud of Lacan, to say the least.
And we'll see this as we get more into the quotes later on and we develop this, but the point is that an instinct is a natural phenomenon, that it's part of an organism's basic biological makeup. And so drive is not natural, it's not part of nature. At the same time, as we'll see, it's not part of culture either. It's in between. It's this weird third space within us as human beings that is neither reducible to our biological, natural side, nor to the purely cultural side either. So drive is some third thing, as we'll come to see.
All right. Yeah, because that would usually be the distinction, is instinct versus culture.
Yeah, or nature versus culture, exactly. And nature so the point is that death drive kind of exists between the two. There's like this in-between space, this almost like limbo. I mean, Zizek calls it the night of the world. He thinks Hegel discovered it. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, so we'll come back to that shortly. So here's the best way to start in understanding death drive. There is a distinction between pleasure principle and death drive, or we should say between pleasure and jouissance. And so if on the board, if you want to start making, you just draw a line and you put a set of terms on. This is a real binary kind of approach, but it's very, very helpful in coming to understand.
Is this the one we did with homeostasis versus the limits with law versus drive, desire versus this is that? And
that's all. Yeah, exactly. That's all tricky. But like, okay, so here's what we'll say is that Pleasure principle is obviously geared towards pleasure. Death drive is geared towards jouissance or enjoyment. And again, I prefer to use the French term because I think enjoyment is confusing.
There's no point. Also,
are synonymous,
Don't look it up on Google. That's not going to be helpful. It's actually going to be misleading. I tried. So jouissance is not just. I think it just says intense pleasure, which is like, yes, true, but because this is a juxtapose to pleasure, it actually doesn't make sense. It actually just leads us astray. So,
and I mean, this is fundamental to this distinction. We will explain what we're getting at in a second. You start off with pleasure on one side and then jouissance on the other. And what correlates to that immediately is pleasure principle obviously correlates to pleasure, and death drive correlates to jouissance. Okay, so here's what we have. Freud has a very specific concept of pleasure, and Lacan, Zizek, McGowan, they're all going to have this same concept of pleasure. What pleasure is for Freud, and for the rest of them, is it's getting rid of excitation in the body. It's a state of calm, it's a state of balance, homeostasis, and that's I mean, the crucial way to think of pleasure is just this ability to have, like, in our bodies, a lack of excitation. And so it's homeostasis, it's balance. but there's all these other things that connect to pleasure, right? So it's only when we have a lack of excitation that we can actually be rational, right? When we have too much excitement in us, regardless of what kind it is, when you're overly excited, you can't really be rational. So pleasure and rationality go together. So at the same time, having a lack of excitation, being able to be rational, to be coherent, to be calm, that's also what is in our good, right? This is why utilitarianism and all these kind of philosophies akin to it make this connection between the good and pleasure and reason, because what you find is our libidinal economies, our bodies, only can really behave rationally, can really pursue our self-interest within a certain kind of state. And that state is a lack of excitation. It's when you're calm, it's when you're comfortable. And so the pleasure principle is always seeking this. It's always seeking a lack of excitation. So this is where you get into, like, well, wait, I thought you seemed like you're contrasting pleasure to jouissance, but I thought it was pleasure principle versus reality principle. There is a certain tension or friction between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, but here's how it works. They both ultimately work together to serve the pleasure principle. They form a unit. Pleasure principle says, I want to evacuate excitation immediately, right? So whether it's sexual or whatever kind of excitation, pleasure is seeking to get back to a homeostatic state as quickly as possible. Of course, whatever it may be, maybe you're super hungry, right? And that the hunger pains have built up this intense feeling of excitation in your body, right? That's the way that we could talk about it. And you don't have any food near you, and somebody's eating a sandwich across the street, and you're like, well, the pleasure principle says just go steal the sandwich so you can return back to a homeostatic state. And of course, reality principle is going, you can't just walk around stealing people's food. You got to wait to eat, so just deal with it. But ultimately, the reality principle is trying to protect the pleasure principle from getting itself into trouble, right? If you just try to find immediate gratification, you're going to it's not really in your self-interest. So
it's just, to me, it was always kind of like, it honestly, like calling it the pleasure, the reality principle just makes it sound so much more, I don't know, almost it's just like jargon instead of just, I mean, but what is it really? It's whenever people go, oh, I get that you want that, but there's reality, you know, oh, sounds good on paper, but like in reality, like people always do this. And then, you know, it's like,
you call it practicing principle.
Well, yeah, I want to have fucking champagne and caviar every day. It's not happening, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, and so the point is, though, yeah, you have this immediate impulse to evacuate all excitation from your body to return to homeostasis. You obviously can't do that without jeopardizing social relations, your social position, and so on and so forth. So the reality principle is there to just help the pleasure principle seek its goals in a way that sustains pleasure in the long run, right? It's almost like pleasure principle is short-term thinking, reality principle is long-term thinking, but they're both ultimately trying to seek the same state of pleasure, homeostasis, balance, equilibrium, lack of excitation. And
wait, so both the reality and the pleasure principle are both trying to achieve that? Is that what you said?
Yeah. And so even though there's a friction between them, they ultimately are on the same side. They're both trying to establish the same state in the body and in the psyche. So that's the way I think of it. Pleasure principle and reality principle, one is short-term, one's long-term thinking. And but their aim is ultimately the same, which is have pleasure in the body. And so when you think about this, right, there's other things that follow. So, and we should also say, while you're, you know, we're making these connections, eros is what is meant by pleasure here. Like eros and pleasure are the same thing. And for Freud's whole, you know, the whole 20 years or so of his career, the first 20 years, everything was focused around pleasure. And pleasure, obviously, it has to do with, you know, I want to be in a safe, secure state. I want to be able to be functional. I need to be in a state where I'm useful and I'm able to use things. So this kind of state gets associated with safety, security, functionality, usefulness, happiness, right? This is how it's associated with the good, with the rational. And so it's also associated with our self-preservation, with self-interest. So you see all of these different things get tied together under what Freud called pleasure. And again, you know, kind of zoom out, it's just our ability to make rational decisions, to, you know, be flexible, to be useful, to function in society, to procure our own good, maintain a balance within ourselves and within our relationships to others, right? And this is what he saw for the first chunk of his career. But in 1920, he finally comes to the point where he's like, okay, here's the issue. My clinical work shows that although I have thought that human beings seek pleasure, and that's the primary thing, my experience dealing with patients has shown there's something else going on here, that humans are constantly sabotaging their pleasure, doing things that are irrational, doing things that go against their good and their self-interest, that constantly break down their homeostasis, that break down their safety and security in the world. And this is where death drive gets formulated, because he saw too many different clinical phenomena that made him realize, like, there has to be something beyond the pleasure principle, right? That's the name of the book. And the beyond of the pleasure principle is death drive. And so now in this book, he makes this huge revelation, which is there's some other principle at work in us that goes against the pleasure principle. This other principle actually seeks our self-destruction. It self-sabotages. It seeks imbalance and disequilibrium and excess. It obviously behaves in ways to us that seem irrational. And it constantly is producing an excess of excitation. It's constantly building up sensation and excitation in the body and in the psyche. And this obviously involves danger, risk, dysfunctionality, uselessness, waste, suffering, and a kind of like repetition compulsion. And so this is death drive, this is Thanatos, and it often, I mean, it's primarily associated with jouissance, right? So to understand death drive, we got to understand jouissance. Well, we've talked about it before, but let's get an idea of what it is here. So again, pleasure is homeostasis in the body. It's a lack of excitation. Jouissance is, as they put it, it's pleasure to the point of pain. And sometimes the terms pleasure and enjoyment and jouissance, sometimes they're used interchangeably and it's confused, but Lacanians have more and more come to make certain terminological distinctions, right? Pleasure is what we've been describing, but jouissance is something else, and it's usually translated as enjoyment. I don't think that's a great word because enjoyment carries too many almost like lighthearted connotations. Jouissance is very intense. It's very problematic. It's traumatic. Zizek always is calling it traumatic because it can so destabilize your life and the lives of those around you. And yet, in a sense, we'll see that it's without jouissance, life almost wouldn't be worth living for us. So there's a lot of ambiguity and complexity when it comes to this. But you and I have talked about this recently, where most Lacanians, when you start talking about jouissance, they want to say, well, in French, jouissance has this very strong, intense sexual connotation, and it even like connotes orgasm. The problem, though, in making this the kind of connection in the English-speaking world for us is that we limit the concept of sexuality to very specific acts. And psychoanalysis has a very, very broad concept of sexual enjoyment, of human sexuality. And so jouissance is just an overabundance of excitation in the body to the point where it's like it's fucking up your life. It's destabilizing things. It's not allowing you to function properly. And so that's kind of the basic way to think about these two. Again, you know, McGowan, that's the basic definitions he gives. Pleasure is a lack of excitation in the body. Jouissance is excessive excitation in the body, excessive stimulation in the body. And it is sexual in this broad sense of the term, but the example I used when we were talking last time, there are certain people who can't go drive in traffic without, I'm not saying they really do road rage, but they're always pissed off. They're always mad and fuming while they're driving in rush hour traffic. And yet I know people who they like to actually put themselves in this situation, even though they would say it drives them crazy.
It's like there's sometimes when someone's like they didn't mean to trigger a rant from me, and it's like my rant is like kind of unrelated. I just wanted to go on this rant right now.
Exactly.
Like maybe that's not, maybe this is actually the wrong place, but sorry, I just literally wanted to. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so what you find is that certain states that we would when we're calm, like when we're speaking right here, we would both say, well, that's an unpleasurable state, but it's not unpleasurable in the sense of like getting your leg sawed off, right? It's not like it doesn't work like that. You actually enjoy it, right? And so there's a lot of forms of jouissance, which is again excessive excitation, that don't line up with what we usually think of as like intense sexual enjoyment. And so that's my only issue with saying, oh, it's intense sexual enjoyment, because I think that's very misleading to people who are new to psychoanalysis.
Well, straight up, the first several times that I saw, well, for years, I thought it was basically just like, this is just BDSM shit. This is just sadomasochism. Like, that's all this is. Like, that's because that's kind of how people talk about it sometimes. And
that involves jouissance. It does, but that's certainly not what it's reducible to.
Yeah. Shredosaurus 69, great name. Shredosaurus 69 was talking about trolling, about jouissance and trolling. When you know, and I've been kind of thinking about how, like, it's interesting how one person's jouissance can be another person's pleasure.
Yeah.
And maybe vice versa, but I haven't thought a lot about that. So, but
anyway. Here's what you would say, though, right? I mean, just based off what we've said so far, if you ask somebody why they're trolling, most of them would say something like, well, I actually want to affect some sort of change, or I'm actually like, yeah, it's like this kind of childish trolling thing, but I'm trying to stand for certain values, all this kind of stuff. But we all know they just enjoy it, right? It's just about the kind of excessive excitation they get from owning the libtards, right? It's not really value based. It's just about this enjoyment that their libidinal economies have become fixated on. And so it's just the enjoyment of pissing people off that they're really after. But that's the thing with death drive and with jouissance, is when we're actually confronted with why we do what we do, we always want to give it some lofty idea, right? Even trolls, even, and you know, as ridiculous as they are, they even want to do it. They act like they do it for some reason. Of course, once in a while you find one that's just honest and would just say, oh, I do it because I enjoy it, right? But most of the time, this is what psychoanalysis is going to show, and we're going to see this more and more as we get deeper into the lecture, is the thing that you think you're aiming at that is going to give you enjoyment isn't really what you're aiming at. You're aiming at this thing that's off to the side, and that's where your source of jouissance or excitation is actually at. And it's this misdirection thing we're constantly doing. The thing we think we want isn't actually what we want. We don't want to get the thing we want. We want to circle it or pursue it in a certain way. And that very pursuit, or as Lacan calls it, that circuit, right? That's what it's an end in itself for death drive. So just the buildup and excitation itself is the goal. But it doesn't seem like that. Like, it wants to act like the goal is something else. And so we'll talk about this more, but basically what you think you're aiming at isn't what you're really aiming at. And so you see that in trolling all the time, that really they just enjoy it, and that's as deep as it goes.
So cool. All right. I think I'm tracking with you so far. Okay.
So here's the thing. Again, at some point I would like to do a list, right? Where you know, there's pleasure, there's jouissance, there's self-preservation, there's self-destruction, there's self-interest, there's self-sabotage, eros and thanatos, balance and imbalance, right? You can it is a very binary logic, but in this case, it's trying to say that our libidinal economies, in a sense, are stretched on a continuum, and that it's always trying to go from one extreme to the other. The one extreme is no excitation in the body, and the other one is like overabundant, excessive excitation. Mm-hmm. And it's like we're torn between these two impulses and going in different directions. This is why being like Nadia and Russian Doll, life is a fucking nightmare. Being a person is a fucking nightmare. She's tapped into this problem where we're always moving in two different directions. Part of us wants stability, safety, security, pleasure, balance. The other part wants to blow it all apart. And this is part of what makes us human and not merely animals, right? Animals are just tapped in to pleasure, right? You don't see animals self-destruct in the way that human beings do. And that's the thing. So it's very easy to go pleasure good, death drive bad, but that's not the case at all. Sometimes we need death drive to help us out of a situation. Sometimes our death drive gets completely out of control and we need more balance and pleasure. And so it's always going to be going case by case to determine it. And so we got to refrain from making these moralistic categorizations of these two principles, because sometimes it's precisely the lack of death drive that's the problem in the situation, and other times it's reversed. So it just depends on the individual.
So being human is being torn between these two things at any given time. And I'm kind of thinking about it just like in just, my average everyday experience. It's like I could eat at this time because that would be probably the wiser time to eat or whatever. It would probably pace my eating in the day out better. But I actually get more pleasure from eating that food if I'm hungrier. So I actually push myself like further. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, think about it like this. Say you're sitting there and you're going, okay, I am working on an essay, and this is crucial to my grade, and my grade is crucial to my future. I need to make good grades, right? There's some part of you that's like, yeah, but take a break. Go watch some TV or play some video game, right? And the death drive, the enjoyment it gets is just from sabotaging your self-interest. And you can always justify these kind of moments where you're like, yeah, but I'm going to use what I'm learning in the video game, or I'm going to use the movie in the essay, but you usually don't. It's just bullshit you tell yourself, because the enjoyment is precisely in, self-sabotaging. And we do this shit to ourselves all the time. And most of the time, it's not that it doesn't ruin our lives, but other times it completely does. And it's really problematic when these different principles are at work in politics, and one of them gets out of control. We're seeing a lot of that with what's going on in the world right now. So these concepts have so much explanatory power that I think it's a good thing that we're discussing them right now.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity and Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.